is my Civil War people. We were so far back in the hills in Happy Valley that not much was going on there during the Civil War. I've called this Friends and Family, and it's really the story. I ran up the stairs because we took time to eat some chili and we're running late, and I apologize for your patience. It's the story of the real story of our people from Happy Valley. And the main families were Whiteheads. They were the first ones there. The first deed I can find for anybody in Happy Valley was in 1862 for a Thomas Whitehead. And I have an ancestor, Thomas Whitehead, so I don't exactly know that I've connected all of that down to a T, but I'm working on it. The Whiteheads were there. They were a big family. The Borings, the Herons, Boones, and Paynes. Those are the 5 families that I have featured here. All but the 4 of those are my relatives. Anyway, they didn't do anything too exciting during the Civil War, except some of them had dysentery, and some others changed sides a couple of times, that sort of thing. So my side of the family is not too interesting, but my husband's is. And with your permission, I would like to talk a little bit about what happened to them during the Civil War in Blount County. The best family. I have, can you hear me? I'm in the back, okay. And I'd like to tell the story from the viewpoint of Mary Etta Best, who was a granddaughter of Granny Jane Ann Best, whose story this is. During the Civil War, not much action took place in Blount County until some of the armies were on their way to Knoxville, and they camped in Blount County a while. And that's when, that was in November of 1863. That, we'll get to that in a minute, I guess. Grandmother Jane Ann, Mollietta would say, would tell about what happened, and she'd take her apron and wipe her tears, and loved to just tell what had happened to the family. She grieved, and she had reason to grieve. She loved to talk about the family, and this Mollietta would sit and listen at grandmother's feet, like many of you all probably already have done too. And she would say she never could write to them when they were away in the war because she didn't know where they were. She couldn't always get paper. The mail and everything else was interrupted, we know, at the time. It was awfully hard for her and the children to keep up the farm with the men folks gone. They had one old mule named Kate that I guess the conscriptors didn't think was worth anything, so they didn't take Kate. When she could write them, she'd tell them how hard it was to have to work the farm, how much they missed them, how she prayed for them every day, prayed for their safety. And she would say she could not understand how a good God could let such a terrible thing as the Civil War happen, how it could take good people away from their families. I love to listen to her stories. None of the boys did. If it didn't talk about guns and cannons and fightings, the little boys didn't want to hear Granny's stories. Our family lived out in the country, of course, and times were hard, awfully hard, for the people out in the country, as you well know. My daddy John and several of the brothers-in-laws had already been made to go to the war. We didn't understand why, because we didn't have slaves. We didn't know what the fighting was all about. We did not really understand why we even had to be involved. One of the things that Granny Jane Ann kept not understanding was why her 53-year-old husband was made to go to the war, because they had sons and son-in-laws that were already gone. They needed him there. 53 back then was old, and so she couldn't understand that at all. And Grandpa George didn't really have strong feelings about which side he wanted to fight for. And when one day the conscriptors came and they wanted to take him away, and he had an 8-year-old daughter still at home, they begged him not to take them, gave all these reasons that he should not have to go to war. But they had guns. So that sort of settled that matter. My mama said that Daddy had wished over and over again that he had been home when the conscriptors came after his daddy, that he wouldn't have let them take him, but they did anyway. So he's gone. But my daddy John didn't want to talk about the war when he finally was able to get home. He would just walk out on the porch and look down to where the barn used to be before the soldiers came, tore it down to get the wood for their campfires. And he would reach in his pocket and pull out a spent bullet and roll it around in his fingers. Think about what all had happened. And we knew better than to interrupt him when he was in one of these moods. He was remembering. An old man told us that he had heard that they took the wood from our barn down to near Hammer's Mill at Unisha, where they were camped while they were on their way over to Knoxville. And so the miller there he had to give most of his product, this grain, the stuff he worked up. I don't know what you call it when you make meal out of corn and wheat and all that. Just cornmeal mostly. They would take most of what, they would just barely leave him a tiny bit for his family. And years later, I read about how he tried to get the government to pay him back for all of the mill stuff they'd taken from him. But I never could find whether he was reimbursed for what he had spent during the war. At that time, the Best family had a mill down off 4 Mile Creek. Daniel Best had come over from Germany, and when he got a permit in 1807 to build that grist mill, the Cherokee Indians still owned the land across 4 Mile Creek where he had his mill. But anyway, he was from Germany, and my daddy says he talked funny, and he couldn't read or write English, so his son kept the daybook, the little daybook with the procedures, the ins and outs of the day, which is in our family still. Everybody at home, the women and the children were afraid. They were afraid. They didn't have guns. They didn't have men to protect them. They really didn't always hear when the soldiers had left Blount County on their way different places. And even after they had, bushwhackers would come over from North Carolina at different times during the war, during the 5 years the war was on. And they would steal anything anybody had that they wanted. And you didn't feel safe. Imagine you're a woman, you're in charge of everything, and you have that to live with for so many years. I ran into a woman that lived up at Walland, a Mrs. King, who told me about her grandmother, who had some sons who were already in the war, but she still had one 16-year-old big boy at home. And she had heard that the soldiers were conscripting in Blount County, and she was so afraid that they would take this son. You know, young, just because he was 16 didn't mean he was too young in those days. So every morning before daylight, she would get him up, pack a lunch. They had a horse that they'd been able to save, and she'd put him on that horse and send him up to Chestnut Flats. Some of you may know where Chestnut Flats are, up above Walland, up in the mountains. And he'd stay there till after dark, and this went on for ages until she was sure that the soldiers, conscriptors, and I never know whether to call them bushwhackers or conscriptors or what, but and sometimes People never knew the difference. You couldn't tell the difference. Anyway, she was able to save her son by doing this. But Grandma Jane Ann wasn't as lucky. She wasn't as lucky. One day, they came to get Grandpa George. And a few hours after that, apparently they were still running around in the county, rounding up folks. She heard that a son-in-law and a friend had been conscripted and that they had been taken, and on the way they had stopped down at Best Spring, which is a real spring on Calderwood Highway, and were bent over getting a drink of water, and for some reason were shot and were left right there at the spring. Folks knew that Granny Jane Ann still had the old mule Kate in a wagon, so they sent for her to come and help them haul the bodies back to their house. So she and the children, they were still at home, harnessed up the mule and hooked up everything and went down the road to get them. They, of course, put them in the wagon and were on their way back to their houses. And the women in the buggy, the wagon, not the buggy, the wagon, wondered how in the world what were they gonna do? Who would they get to dig the graves? Who would they get to build the caskets? How were they gonna live? What were they gonna do? It was a sad time. They had laughed because not too many days before even, they had heard that the conscriptors or the bushwhackers were in the area, and Cousin Allie then was the hero of the story for several days there. She looked out and saw that they were coming down in the yard, at the edge of the yard, and she ran into the kitchen, sat down on their only sack of flour, spread her skirt around it, and sat there. And the conscriptors came in with their guns, turning things over, looking in all the cabinets and jerking the leather bridges off the wall and all of that kind of stuff. Went upstairs, tore up the beds, threw the clothes all over the place, came back down the stairs, cussing up a blue streak. Hadn't found anything, but Cousin Allie didn't move. She sat on that sack of flour, and that made her a hero in the community for a few days. And she figured they were hungry. They were hungry. If they were soldiers indeed, if they were really conscriptors for one or the other side of the army, they were having trouble feeding their troops, feeding their horses. I have a lady made some real hardtack. And this is apparently what they had to eat, a lot. When you feel it, you'll know. You'd know why to be able to eat it, you'd have to soak it in your coffee or in your hot water or whatever. You couldn't bite into it otherwise. But this is, you know, they were really hungry. Some of them were really hungry. And I guess if you were desperate, if you were in charge of a whole company of hungry men, you know, you were the sergeant in charge or the general, whatever. I'm not sure what you would do. But anyway. Granny Jane has gotten back home, and then the worst possible news came. Grandpa George had also been shot down where 9 Mile Creek runs into the Little Tennessee River. Somebody that knew what happened or saw what happened came to tell her. We don't know whether Grandpa George was trying to escape or whatever, but he was shot and his body was left in the river, never to be found again. And she grieved, and she grieved, and she grieved. She grieved as long as she lived. She would tell Marietta, Marietta, and anybody else who would listen. She did not live too many years after Grandpa George had died. This was November the 13th of 1863 when this happened. Somebody also told her that Maryville had been shot up. The town had been fired on, is the term I guess I want. The Maryville had been fired on, the courthouse had been burned. Only a few of the records had been saved by a slave, Polly Toole, who had been able to put some in her apron and carry them out of the courthouse. So if you're looking for certain historical records, and I'm not sure exactly which ones she was able to save, I guess I need to look that up. It was a bad time. They didn't stay there forever, you know, so they went on to Knoxville. And people kept on with what they could do. The children had a tough time, and one of the stories that I loved to tell is about the children, what all the children had to do, how hard they had to work. And one of the things that I'm sure they had to do, which I did when I was a child, was go out to the tater patch and pick all the green tater bugs off the leaves. Anybody in here ever done that? Okay. Big, fat, juicy green potato bugs. And then put them in their buckets and count and see who got the most, and then feed them to the chickens. And of course, back in Grandma Jane Ann's time, they didn't have many chickens then, but most people managed to keep a few chickens along. As I said, Grandma Jane Ann grieved all her life. It was time for people, and it still is time for people to remind their children of tough times, how things went. I came across this prayer from General Robert E. Lee. And in it he said to his soldiers, "My daily prayer to the great ruler of this world is that he may shield you from all future harm, guard you from all evil, and give you that peace which the world cannot take away." And that could have been prayed for all soldiers everywhere, I'm sure, at the time. Now, the big things that I told you about all happened to Herman's family. So, do you have questions?
What happened to the family after the war? Could you go into more detail about that a little bit?
About the family after the war? They kept farming, taking care of cattle, and living on a part of the land grant that the family had all along.
Where was their property?
Where was their property?
Their best one.
Down off Calderwood Highway. If you know where 4 Mile Church is, to the left, Lanier Road intersection in that area, to the left there.
Wasn't that far from where you grew up?
What?
Wasn't that far from where you grew up?
Well, in Happy Valley, yeah.
It's
As the crow flies,
10 miles
maybe
away.
not too far, but at that time, in the days of walking or horse and buggies, one of the things I say in the introduction to my book, people make jokes about the fact that everybody's kin. And of course, when you think, and that's about the truth, but the fact that before the days of cars and telephones, a lot of folks intermarried with Cades Cove. There's marriages both ways. I have walked from Happy Valley to Cades Cove several years ago, and I was tired. If I was a young person looking for a sweetheart, I don't know how many times I would have made that trip. That was probably the closest place to go.
Were there people who hid from the transcriptions?
I'm sure there were. I don't have that knowledge of our families, although one of the things I didn't say here is a story of, and this fella is in my family, so I'll tell you about him. They lived in Georgia, northern Georgia somewhere, and they didn't have slaves or anything. Didn't really want, that family didn't want to get involved in the war. But one of these young men wanted to go to war. So he joined the Confederacy. He'd show him. So he joined, was captured just right away. He must not have been real smart. And was captured, was in prison for a while, and decided the only way to get out of prison was to join the other side, which he did. And so he hadn't been in long at all. He took the oath of office, began as a Unionist. In the first battle, his officers were killed. Most of his men, the rest of the men in his company, scattered and ran off, goodness knows where. And he and a cousin and another man were left alive and together. And so they decided, well, shucks, we don't know where to go or who's going to lead us. We'll just go back home too. So they started home. And that night, they were sleeping behind a big log that had fallen, and they woke up to see an Indian over him with a tomahawk. So the other man jumped up and started back the direction they'd come from, and the last they ever saw of him, he was going out of sight with the Indian close behind, and they had no idea whatever happened to him. But they went on home back to Georgia, hid out, the story goes, until the war was over. Does that answer your question? Okay. Any others? Yes.
Did not a lot of Blount County people that were favoring the Union go other places to enlist because
Yes.
Blount County had?
Yes. In fact, one of my Whitehead ancestors had to go to Kentucky for some
I went to Cumberland, yeah.
Yeah, to join. And if you don't know about it, I'll plug in our Blount County Museum and in the public library are lists of all the Blount County people who were in the war, on both sides. Becky Blankenship Darrell has done that. Super job. Yeah. What else? I know any of you could have, you have a story. Write them down for your children and grandchildren. Because as we old folks get gone, they're not going to have access to those stories. Okay.
Betty, we thank you.